The heavy glass doors shut behind her with a sharp click, sealing her inside an office that smelled faintly of leather, cologne, and dominance. Julia Ramos tightened her grip on her worn handbag, the faded strap creaking under the pressure of her fingers. The desk in front of her was wide, polished, and intimidating, a stage from which Victor Delgado commanded empires. He did not rise to greet her. He leaned back in his chair, the skyline of São Paulo stretching out behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. His face was carved into an expression that seemed to blend boredom with cruelty, as though he had been waiting for this performance. "You know why you're here," Victor said, his voice deep and unhurried. Julia shook her head, though her heart was already hammering against her ribs. She had spent years in his house, caring for his twin sons, Mateo and Gabriel. She had watched over them at night, measured out their fragile doses of medication with hands that never trembled, and whispered songs when pain had kept them awake. She knew she had done nothing wrong. "I don't," she answered quietly. Victor tapped a folder on his desk, thick with papers and photographs. "Medicine has gone missing. Expensive, life-saving treatment for my boys. Stolen, Julia. And do you know whose fingerprints are all over the storage cabinet?" Her mouth went dry. She shook her head again. "That isn't possible. I would never—" He cut her off with a hand, a gesture that silenced not only her words, but seemed to dismiss her entire existence. "The police will think otherwise. They already do. Evidence piles up, and your name sits at the top." Julia's breath caught. "That isn't evidence, it's a lie." Victor leaned forward now, elbows resting on the mahogany surface, his eyes narrowing with venom. "You don't belong here. You don't belong in my world. And when this is over, everyone will know exactly what kind of woman you are." The words struck harder than she expected. She had endured insults before, whispers from house staff, neighbors who wondered how a woman from the outskirts of the city ended up in the mansion of one of Brazil's wealthiest men. But this accusation was different. It carried the weight of law, of ruin, of public humiliation. "I've taken care of your children as if they were mine," Julia said, her voice cracking. "I have sacrificed everything for them. How can you—" Victor stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor. His height, his presence, dwarfed her. "Because no one will believe you. I am Victor Delgado. You are just the help." Her knees weakened, and she clutched the strap of her bag tighter, as if it could anchor her against the storm gathering around her. She searched his face for any trace of the man who had once thanked her, quietly, in the dim light of a hospital room after one of the twins had survived another crisis. But that man was gone. Or maybe he had never existed at all. He reached for the phone on his desk, pressing a button with calm finality. "Security will show you out. The police will do the rest." Julia turned, stumbling slightly, as the door opened behind her. Two guards waited, their expressions impassive. She stepped into the hallway, the world around her tilting with each heartbeat. The echo of his voice followed her, relentless and cold. "Nobody will stand by you." Outside the building, the city moved as if nothing had changed. Cars honking, vendors shouting, the golden light of late afternoon pouring across the avenue. But inside Julia, everything had collapsed. She walked without direction, the accusation replaying in her mind until it became a cruel chant. Medicine stolen. Evidence against her. The police. By the time she reached the bus stop, the weight of humiliation pressed so hard on her chest that breathing felt like labor. She sank onto the bench, her bag clutched in her lap, and let the crowd blur around her. In the glass pane of the shelter, her reflection stared back at her. Tired eyes, hair pulled into a simple knot, a uniform still neat from a day of service. Did she really look like a thief? The bus arrived with a groan, and she climbed aboard. As it jolted forward, she closed her eyes and imagined Mateo and Gabriel, fragile, smiling despite the tubes and wires that often bound them. They would not believe these lies. They couldn't. But Victor was right about one thing. He was powerful. His voice would carry farther than hers ever could, and soon the world would hear only his version of the truth. At home, the apartment greeted her with silence. A stack of unpaid bills rested on the counter, beside a half-eaten plate of rice she had left in her rush that morning. She dropped her bag and sank into the small sofa, every muscle trembling. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. She picked up her phone and saw the messages already appearing. Neighbors gossiping, friends asking questions she could not bear to answer. The story was spreading fast. A headline appeared in a local news feed. Millionaire's nanny accused of stealing children's medication. Her stomach lurched. The phone buzzed again, this time an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "This is Detective Carvalho," a male voice announced. "We'll need you to come to the station tomorrow morning. There are charges to discuss." Julia swallowed hard. "Charges? I didn't—" "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, the detective interrupted. "Don't be late." The line went dead. Julia dropped the phone, the sound echoing in the stillness of the apartment. Tomorrow her life would change forever, and she could do nothing to stop it. She curled onto the sofa, pulling a thin blanket around herself. The city outside her window buzzed with life, indifferent to her despair. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. Hours passed. The ticking of the clock grew louder, a reminder that morning crept closer. And with it, judgment. By dawn, Julia rose from the sofa, exhausted but resolute. She washed her face, tied her hair back, and dressed in her plainest clothes. She would walk into the police station with her head held high, though fear gnawed at every step. She whispered to herself, the words trembling but determined, "I am not guilty." But even as she spoke, doubt coiled in her chest. What if no one believed her? What if Victor was right? The question hung over her as she left the apartment, a storm cloud that would follow her into the day ahead. And somewhere in the distance, the city prepared for a spectacle, a trial where truth would be buried under wealth and lies, unless Julia could find a way to rise above them. The police station smelled of coffee and mildew, the kind of place where secrets piled up in drawers and never quite disappeared. Julia Ramos sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap to stop their trembling. The morning rush had brought a sea of uniforms and voices, but no one looked at her, not really. She was just another suspect waiting to be processed. Detective Carvalho appeared at the door of his office, a man in his 50s with a tired face that spoke of too many late nights and too many lies heard. He beckoned her in with a flick of his fingers. "Sit," he said flatly once she entered. Julia lowered herself into the chair opposite his desk. Her eyes darted across the papers spread before him, printouts of text messages she had never written, blurry photographs of her entering storage rooms at hours she had never been there. Carvalho adjusted his glasses and tapped the stack. "You understand these are serious accusations, yes?" Julia swallowed hard. "I understand what they are, but they're not true." He raised his eyes to her, weighing her words. "Victor Delgado has money, influence. If he says you stole the medication, it's enough to start a case." Her voice shook as she spoke. "I didn't steal anything. I cared for those children as if they were my own." The detective leaned back, studying her. "That may be. But perception, Senora Ramos, is a powerful thing. Right now, perception is not on your side." Julia pressed her palms together until they ached. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand that the photographs were fabrications, the messages clever forgeries. But she saw in his weary eyes that none of it mattered yet. The machine was already in motion. By the afternoon, she was released, but not free. Her neighbors' stares followed her as she returned home, their whispers sharp as knives. In the hallway of her building, a woman she had known for years pulled her child closer, as though Julia carried a contagion. "Thief!" someone muttered as she passed. That night, Julia sat in the dim light of her apartment, scrolling through news articles. Every headline screamed the same story. Nanny steals medication from millionaire's children. Her photograph, taken years ago at a family gathering, now stared back at her with cruel detachment. She read the comments beneath the articles, each one a dagger. She should rot in jail. Imagine stealing from sick children. People like her are monsters. Julia dropped the phone, tears spilling down her face. She whispered to herself, her voice breaking, "I didn't do this." The following days blurred into a nightmare. Reporters gathered outside her building, cameras flashing when she stepped out to buy bread. Her phone buzzed with calls she didn't answer, messages she couldn't bear to read. The landlord knocked on her door, his tone sharp. "This building doesn't need attention from the press," he told her. "You should think about finding another place." Her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had nowhere else to go. When the official summons arrived for the first court hearing, Julia's stomach turned to stone. She had no lawyer, no money to hire one. The court assigned a public defender, but on the morning of the hearing he failed to appear. She stood alone in the crowded room, her knees shaking as the clerk called her name. The judge, an austere man with a grey beard, looked down at her from the bench. "Proceedings will continue," he declared. Julia opened her mouth. "Your Honor, my lawyer—" "Sit down, Señora Ramos," the judge interrupted. His tone carried no space for protest. Across the room, Victor Delgado sat with his legal team, their suits sharp, their files organized. His expression was unreadable, but the faintest curve of his lips suggested satisfaction. The prosecution presented the so-called evidence: video footage showing a woman of Julia's build entering the medication storage late at night, bank transfers into accounts she had never seen before, text messages arranging sales of drugs to strangers. Each piece struck her like a blow. "That's not me," Julia said when the video was shown. "I was home with the children that night." The prosecutor smirked. "Convenient memory, Señora Ramos. But the camera does not lie." She turned to the judge. "Please, those messages, they're not mine. I never—" Again she was silenced with a gesture. The courtroom shifted, whispers crawling through the gallery. Julia lowered her head, heat rising to her face, the shame unbearable. She glanced toward Victor. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on her, cold and triumphant. When the session ended, Julia stumbled from the courtroom, the sound of reporters flooding her ears. "Julia, why did you do it? Do you feel guilty stealing from children? Do you have anything to say to the family?" Flashes blinded her as she pushed past them, her voice trapped in her throat. Back in the solitude of her apartment, she collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with sobs. The world had turned against her, and she no longer knew how to fight back. As the night deepened, Julia sat in darkness, the silence pressing in. For the first time, she let herself wonder if Victor had been right in that towering office. Maybe nobody would believe her. Maybe she was already condemned. The clock ticked on, dragging her toward the next hearing, where more humiliation awaited. The city outside hummed, uncaring, while inside her heart, hope flickered dangerously close to extinguishing. Yet somewhere in that darkness, a memory of Mateo and Gabrielle surfaced, their fragile smiles, their trust in her arms. She clung to it, though doubt gnawed at its edges. And as dawn approached, she rose again, exhausted but breathing, carrying the unbearable weight of a truth no one seemed willing to hear. The courthouse was colder the second time. Julia Ramos sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white. The buzzing of conversation around her swelled like a hive, reporters murmuring, spectators whispering, the sound of papers shuffling in anticipation. She kept her eyes on the floor, afraid to meet the gaze of anyone present. She could feel their judgment pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She had not slept. Her skin was pale, her eyes ringed with dark shadows, but she forced herself to sit tall, though inside she was breaking. The judge entered, his gavel striking once to call the room to order. The prosecutor rose, a sleek woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She carried herself with confidence, her heels clicking against the marble floor as if each step declared victory. "Your Honor," she began, her voice ringing clear, "the evidence we bring today will further demonstrate the betrayal committed by the defendant, Julia Ramos. We will show that she abused her position of trust to steal life-saving medication from 2 innocent children." Julia's chest tightened. Her mouth was dry. The prosecutor gestured toward a large monitor as a video began to play. The grainy footage showed a woman entering the storage room in the Delgado mansion. The image was dark, blurred, but the outline resembled her. "That's not me," Julia whispered, but her voice was lost in the hum of the courtroom. When the footage ended, the prosecutor spoke again. "This video was captured by security cameras. The defendant is clearly visible, time-stamped, indisputable." Julia forced her voice louder. "That's not me," she said, turning toward the judge. "I was with the boys. I never entered that room." The prosecutor's lips curled. Of course, she denies it. Criminals always deny. The room rustled with murmurs. Julia's face flushed. Next came the printouts of bank records. Transactions she had never made, accounts she had never opened. The prosecutor waved them before the court, her words slicing through Julia's defenses. Here we have transfers totaling thousands of reais. Money moved shortly after the medication disappeared. Is it not clear what happened? The defendant stole and sold what she could never afford. Julia shook her head violently. I don't know those accounts. I don't know those people. The judge raised a hand, his voice firm. Order. The court will not descend into chaos. Julia sank back into her chair, her chest heaving. She wanted to scream, to rip the papers from their hands and tear them apart, but her voice was drowned by the current of authority sweeping against her. Then came the text messages, printed pages filled with conversations supposedly between her and an anonymous buyer. One message read, I can deliver the medicine tonight. Price is as we agreed. Julia felt her stomach twist. That's not me, she said again, her voice breaking. I never wrote those words. The prosecutor looked at her with disdain. Are we to believe these are fabricated? That an entire web of evidence has been invented? Julia's hands trembled. Yes, she answered, though it came out almost as a whisper. Yes, that's exactly what this is. The laughter that rose from the gallery was quiet but cruel. Julia's eyes filled with tears, her vision blurring as she lowered her head. From across the room, Victor Delgado sat watching, his face calm, unreadable, like a man observing a game he already knew he had won. His presence was suffocating, his silence louder than any accusation. The prosecutor pressed forward, each word like a nail in Julia's coffin. We are speaking of children, fragile children, whose lives depend on these treatments, and this woman, this trusted caregiver, chose greed over duty. Her betrayal is not only criminal, it is monstrous. Julia's chest ached. She wanted to cry out, to tell them how many nights she had stayed awake by the twins' bedsides, how many times she had prayed for their health, how many times she had given more of herself than she had to give. But her voice caught in her throat. When she finally managed to speak, her words came low and desperate. I love those boys. I would never hurt them. Please believe me. The judge glanced at her, expression unmoved, and then looked back at the prosecutor. Continue. Julia's heart sank. The hours dragged on, each new accusation hammering her further into the ground. The gallery fed on it, eyes hungry for scandal, ears thirsty for drama. Julia felt her identity crumbling, her name becoming something ugly, something despised. By the time the session ended, she was hollow. She stepped into the hallway, reporters closing in like vultures. Microphones shoved into her face, cameras flashing. Julia, why won't you admit it? One reporter demanded. Did you need the money that badly? Asked another. Are you ashamed of what you've done? She pushed past them, her breath coming fast, her pulse loud in her ears. She reached the outside steps, where the sky was overcast and heavy, and collapsed against the cold stone wall. Her hands covered her face as sobs shook her body. She stayed there until the crowd thinned, until the cameras turned away, until the world forgot her for the evening. Then she rose, weak but determined to walk home. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible chains dragged her down. At her apartment, she locked the door and sank into a chair, staring at the empty table. For the first time, she allowed the thought to creep in fully, sharp and poisonous. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe she was alone. She whispered into the stillness, her voice fractured. Who will ever believe me? The silence answered back with nothing. Yet as she sat there, a faint memory stirred. Mateo's small hand clutching hers, Gabriel's soft voice calling her Mama Julia when fear had woken him at night. That bond was real, undeniable. The boys knew her heart, even if the world had turned against her. The thought did not banish her despair, but it gave her something fragile to cling to, a thread of hope, thin as glass, yet unbroken. The night stretched long and merciless. She sat awake, staring out the window at the city lights, the sound of traffic a distant murmur. Inside her chest, sorrow battled with resolve, each breath a war between giving up and holding on. And though she could not yet see it, the turning point was already on its way. Because the next time Julia Ramos stepped into that courtroom, the silence would not belong only to her. Other voices were about to rise, voices too young to be ignored, and they would begin to shatter the story Victor Delgado had built so carefully. The apartment was quiet when Julia returned that evening, too quiet. She shut the door behind her, but the silence did not comfort. It pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The neighbors had stopped greeting her in the hallways. Even their doors seemed to close a little faster when she passed, as if she carried a disease. She set her bag on the table and sank into the chair. The bills lay where she had left them, their numbers climbing higher each month. Beside them, a thin envelope held the official court notice of her next hearing. She stared at it until the letters blurred, her vision fogged by exhaustion and tears. Julia pressed her hands against her face. The whispers from the courtroom still echoed in her head, the prosecutor's words circling like vultures. Each accusation replayed, louder in memory than it had been in reality. She rose suddenly, restless, and paced the small room. Every corner seemed too tight, every shadow a reminder of her powerlessness. She opened the window, but even the night air carried no relief. The city lights twinkled, mocking her. Down below, people hurried across the streets, laughing, talking, living lives untouched by her disgrace. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the floor, her back against the wall. She whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking. "I can't fight them, they're too strong." Her eyes stung as she let the words out, words she had resisted saying until now. She had always believed in persistence, in holding on, in finding strength for the boys. But tonight that belief faltered. Julia tilted her head back, staring at the ceiling, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. For one dangerous moment, she imagined what it would be like to disappear. To pack a single bag, leave the city, abandon the fight. To let the accusations stand and run until no one knew her name. The thought both terrified and tempted her. But then, memory struck. Mateo's frail hand clutching her wrist during a fever. Gabriel's soft voice calling out, "Don't leave, Mama Julia," when nightmares had woken him. Their trust, their faith, their small, fragile hearts that had always beat in rhythm with her care. Tears slid down her cheeks. She pressed her fists against her chest, as though she could hold the memories inside, as though they could shield her from the crushing despair. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling but insistent. "You didn't do this. You are not guilty." The words came again, stronger this time. "You are not guilty." For a moment, she let herself believe them. She let herself remember the nights she had carried Mateo from bed to couch so he could breathe easier, the hours she had sat awake counting Gabriel's heartbeats, the sacrifices she had made quietly, without expecting gratitude. That woman could not vanish. That woman could not give in. Julia rose slowly from the floor, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. She moved to the mirror above the sink, staring at her reflection. Her eyes were swollen, her hair unkempt, her face pale. She hardly recognized herself, but as she stared, she whispered again, steady this time. "You are not guilty." The woman in the mirror looked tired, but she also looked determined. She pulled open a drawer and found the small notebook she had kept for years. Inside, pages were filled with meticulous notes, medication schedules, symptoms, observations about the twins' health. She had written everything, from fevers to changes in appetite, to the nights when they had woken crying. It was her quiet record of devotion, proof that she had always been vigilant. She placed the notebook on the table and rested her hand on it. It was not much, not compared to the fabricated evidence Victor commanded, but it was hers. And it was true. Julia stayed awake through the night, writing in the margins, adding details she remembered, strengthening the record. She filled page after page until the pen ran out of ink. By the time the sun rose, exhaustion weighed on her, but something inside her had shifted. She still felt the crushing force of Victor's power, still feared the prosecutor's sharp tongue and the gallery's hungry stares. But beneath it, a quiet fire had begun to burn. She brewed coffee, though she could hardly swallow it. She opened the window and let the pale morning light spill into the room. The city was waking, noisy and indifferent, but inside her chest, determination had begun to grow. Later that day, she returned to the market where she had once shopped freely. The vendors eyed her warily, their greetings forced, their smiles thin. A woman whispered loudly enough for Julia to hear, "That's her, the one who stole from children." Julia did not stop to defend herself. She kept walking, her head high though her stomach twisted. She chose not to answer, because her fight no longer lay in convincing strangers. It lay in proving her truth where it mattered most. That evening she sat once more with the notebook. She flipped through the pages, each line a reminder of her role in the boys' lives. She paused on one entry, Gabriel's fever at 3 in the morning, how she had sat with him for hours until he fell asleep again. She remembered the sound of his breathing, uneven and fragile, and how she had whispered promises to protect him. She closed the notebook gently, her hand lingering on the cover. The night outside was still dark, but within her the storm had calmed. She was not free of fear, but she had chosen not to surrender. The thought of disappearing, of running, had lost its pull. When she finally lay down, she allowed herself a few hours of sleep. The clock ticked on, steady, relentless, but no longer unbearable. And though the world remained hostile, Julia Ramos had chosen her path. She would walk into the next hearing with her head high. She would fight even if her voice shook, even if her knees trembled. Because the boys had trusted her, and that trust was stronger than Victor Delgado's lies. She closed her eyes, the faintest trace of strength settling in her chest. What she did not know was that fate was preparing a shift. Soon voices too innocent to be dismissed would break the silence, and her fight would no longer be hers alone. The courthouse steps loomed like a mountain as Julia approached. Her body felt heavy, as though she carried not just her own weight but the weight of every whispered accusation, every headline, every suspicious glance. The morning air was sharp, cutting into her lungs as she climbed. Reporters clustered near the entrance, cameras flashing as they caught sight of her. "Julia, do you have a statement?" one shouted. "Are you ready to confess?" asked another. She lowered her gaze and pressed forward, the barrage of voices bouncing off her like stones. She whispered to herself as she crossed the threshold, "You are not guilty." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Victor Delgado sat at the front, his suit immaculate, his posture regal. His legal team shuffled papers with quiet confidence, their expressions already triumphant. Julia took her seat, her hands trembling as she clasped her notebook tightly in her lap. The judge entered, calling the court to order. The prosecutor rose, her voice crisp and cutting. "Your Honor, today we bring further proof of the defendant's betrayal. Beyond video and financial evidence, we present written messages that reveal her intent to profit from the suffering of innocent children." Julia's chest tightened as more pages were displayed, printed conversations she had never seen, words she had never typed. She shook her head, speaking aloud. "Those aren't mine. I never wrote those." The prosecutor turned to the judge. "And yet here they are, traced to her phone records. Her denials are predictable, lies upon lies." The gallery murmured in agreement. Julia felt her stomach twist, her breaths shallow. Victor's lawyer stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, we ask that the court recognize the clear pattern of behavior. This woman exploited her role to enrich herself at the expense of children. She should face the maximum penalty." Julia's heart pounded. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She thought of the notebook in her lap, her quiet proof of care. But what was it against the flood of evidence they commanded? The judge leaned forward. "Does the defendant have anything further to present?" Julia rose shakily. "I have records. My own notes. Every dose of medication, every symptom, years of it. I've never missed a detail." She held up the notebook, her voice trembling. "This is the truth. I never betrayed those boys." The prosecutor's laugh was sharp. "A notebook, self-written. That proves nothing. It is the word of a desperate woman against a mountain of evidence." Julia felt her knees weaken. She sank back into her chair, the notebook still clutched in her hands, her lifeline and yet so powerless here. The judge began to speak, his tone final, when the sound of the doors opening cut through the courtroom. Heads turned, A murmur rippled through the gallery. Two small figures entered, their steps unsteady. Matteo leaned on a walker, his face pale but determined. Gabriel followed in a wheelchair, his thin arms gripping the wheels as he pushed forward. Their nurse guided them, but it was their presence that froze the room into silence. Julia's breath caught. Her heart leapt to her throat. "No," she whispered under her breath, tears welling. "They shouldn't be here." The twins moved slowly down the aisle, every eye on them, until they reached the front. They looked at the judge, their voices faint but steady. Matteo spoke first, his words clear despite his weakness. "We want to say something." The judge blinked, startled. "This is highly irregular. These children are not on the witness list." Gabriel's small voice broke through. "Please, we have to." The room held its breath. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Let them speak." The nurse wheeled Gabriel forward, while Matteo clung to his walker beside him. Both turned toward Julia. Gabriel said softly, "She didn't steal anything. She never hurt us. She's the one who gives us medicine when we're sick. She's the one who stays awake all night when we can't breathe. She's our mama, Julia." Matteo's voice trembled but carried. "We saw who was in the medicine room. It wasn't her, it was the other lady, the one with the black hair. She took boxes out." Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor stiffened. Victor's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. All eyes turned toward the sleek woman sitting beside Victor, his attorney, renowned for her ruthless efficiency. Her face tightened, a shadow crossing her composure. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Children, are you certain of what you saw?" Matteo nodded, his grip firm on the walker. "Yes, we're sure. She put the boxes in a bag. We were in the hallway. She didn't see us." Gabriel added, "We didn't tell anyone because we were scared. But we can't let them blame Mama Julia. It's not fair." Julia covered her mouth, her body trembling with sobs. She had dreamed of someone believing her, but never imagined it would be the boys themselves, fragile yet brave. The judge turned to the attorney in question. "Do you wish to respond to this allegation?" Her face flushed, but she forced a smile. "Children are easily mistaken, Your Honor. They are ill, often confused. Their memories cannot be considered reliable." But the gallery was no longer on her side. Whispers spread quickly, suspicion shifting from Julia to the woman who had built her career on manipulation. Julia's loyalist state suddenly seemed less critical. She was no longer alone. The truth had pierced the silence, spoken not by her, but by the very voices no one could ignore. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his tone heavy. "This revelation warrants further inquiry. We will recess while I review these claims." The gavel struck. The courtroom erupted. Reporters whispered frantically into their phones, cameras flashing as Julia rose, tears streaking her face. The twins reached out, and she rushed forward, kneeling beside them. Matteo whispered, "We couldn't let them hurt you." Gabriel added softly, "We love you." Julia pulled them close, her sobs muffled against their small shoulders. The gallery watched, some with pity, some with awe, as a woman once branded as a thief was embraced by the very children she was accused of betraying. Victor Delgado sat frozen, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the attorney beside him. The empire of certainty he had built was beginning to crack. For the first time, Julia felt the tide shift. It was only a glimpse of hope, fragile and uncertain, but it was real. She whispered to the boys, her voice breaking, "Thank you. Thank you for saving me." The courtroom buzzed on, but for Julia, the world had narrowed to the two fragile souls in her arms. And though the battle was far from over, a truth had been planted. It would grow and it would not be silenced. The courtroom remained in chaos long after the gavel struck. Reporters whispered into microphones, phones buzzed with urgent calls, and spectators leaned toward each other, voices hushed but excited. Julia sat frozen, still clutching the hands of Matteo and Gabriel. Their small fingers trembled in hers, but their eyes shone with a resolve she hadn't expected. When the judge returned from recess, the room slowly quieted. His face was stern, his voice heavy. "This court cannot ignore the testimony of these children. An independent review of the storage room will begin immediately. Until then, proceedings will be suspended." The gavel came down again and the session adjourned. Julia leaned down, her voice soft as she spoke to the boys. "You shouldn't have come. It was too dangerous for you to be here." Matteo shook his head, his expression firm despite his pale skin. "We had to, nobody was listening." Gabriel's voice wavered but carried a quiet strength. "We couldn't let them hurt you anymore." Her heart ached. She pulled them both close, whispering, "Thank you. I don't deserve this kind of courage." The nurse came quickly, concerned for their fragile health. She guided them back, but before they left, Gabriel turned in his chair and called out, "Tell the truth, Mama Julia. Don't let them win." Julia wiped her tears as the boys disappeared through the doors. The gallery buzzed louder than ever, half scandalized, half moved. Victor Delgado rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger. He leaned toward his attorney, his voice sharp enough for those near him to hear. "Fix this. Now." But the attorney, the very woman accused by the children, looked pale. Her usual composure cracked under the weight of suspicion. "I'll handle it," she said quickly, though her eyes betrayed doubt. Over the following days, investigators entered the Delgado mansion. They reviewed security footage frame by frame, inspected locks, and traced inventory records. Whispers began to circulate. The videos presented in court had irregularities, cuts and timestamps that did not match. One evening, Julia sat alone in her apartment when there was a knock at the door. She hesitated before opening it to find Detective Carvalho. His face was serious but not unkind. "Senora Ramos," he said quietly, "I need to ask you some questions. May I come in?" She stepped aside, gesturing to the small table where her notebook still lay open. Carvalho sat, pulling a folder from under his arm. "The children's testimony forced us to look deeper, and what we found concerns me." Julia's hands tightened around her cup of tea. "What did you find?" He opened the folder. Inside were photos of documents, hospital records, and internal logs from the mansion. Several deliveries of medication were signed for by someone other than you. The signature matches your employer's attorney, and the security footage we used as evidence. It shows signs of tampering. Julia's breath caught. So it wasn't me. Carvalho met her gaze. "It looks that way, but the power of Delgado's name is strong. He can bury this unless we are precise." She whispered, "What can I do?" "Keep holding on," Carvalho said. "We're not done yet, but this is the first crack in his wall." When he left, Julia closed the door gently and leaned against it. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a fragile smile. The next court session arrived with heavier tension. The prosecutor entered with less confidence than before, her eyes darting nervously. The gallery, once united against Julia, now buzzed with uncertainty. The judge addressed the court. "New evidence has come to light. The footage previously submitted may have been altered. Medication records implicate another party. This court will hear these findings." Gasps filled the room as the investigator presented the tampered footage, pointing out inconsistencies, sudden jumps, mismatched timestamps, and frames where objects shifted unnaturally. The prosecutor rose, her voice sharp but thinner than before. "These so-called inconsistencies are not proof. They could be technical errors." But the investigator pressed on, displaying signatures that clearly belonged to Victor's attorney. The gallery leaned in, whispers growing louder. Julia sat motionless, clutching her notebook. Her heart raced with every revelation. Victor Delgado's face hardened. He leaned toward his attorney, his voice low and furious. "You said this was airtight," she whispered back, her mask finally slipping. "I didn't think they would find it." The judge's gaze fell on her. "Do you deny signing for these medications?" Her lips parted, then closed again. Beads of sweat formed at her temple. Finally, she stammered, I don't recall." The room erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking. Julia's breath came fast. The tide was shifting, but she knew the battle wasn't won. Victor still held power, still controlled narratives, still commanded fear. The judge struck his gavel for silence. This court will continue to examine these irregularities. Until then, Señora Ramos remains under accusation, but the matter is far from resolved. The session adjourned. Outside, the crowd surged again, reporters firing questions. "Julia, how do you feel about the new evidence? Do you think the attorney set you up? Will you sue Delgado for damages?" Julia kept walking, her voice low as she repeated the words she had clung to for weeks. "I am not guilty." But that night, as she sat by the window watching the city lights flicker against the dark, she knew the ground was shifting beneath Victor Delgado's empire. And though she was still trapped in his storm, the truth had begun to pierce through the clouds. What she did not yet know was how violent the storm's collapse would be, or how far Delgado would go to maintain control as his world began to unravel. The courthouse was packed tighter than ever. Word of tampered evidence had spread quickly, and now the air buzzed with anticipation. Reporters filled every corner, their cameras ready to capture the collapse of a man once thought untouchable. Julia Ramos sat at her table, clutching her notebook. She was exhausted, but beneath the weariness there was a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Victor Delgado entered with his entourage, his jaw set, his eyes cold. He walked with the confidence of a man who still believed he could bend the world to his will. His attorney trailed beside him, but her posture had changed. Gone was the sharp stride and lifted chin. Now her movements were stiff, hesitant. When the judge called the session to order, the courtroom fell into silence. His voice carried a new weight. "This court has received compelling evidence of manipulated video footage and forged records. We will hear from the investigative team and from those directly implicated." The lead investigator stepped forward. "Your Honor, after examining the footage presented by the prosecution, we discovered multiple irregularities. Frames were altered, timestamps adjusted. These edits point to intentional manipulation rather than technical error. Additionally, hospital supply logs show repeated medication withdrawals, signed not by Señora Ramos, but by attorney Mariana Costa, representing Mr. Delgado. The gallery erupted in murmurs. All eyes turned toward Mariana. The judge's gaze was unyielding. "Señora Costa, how do you explain these signatures?" Mariana's lips trembled as she tried to steady her voice. I was authorized to handle certain deliveries on behalf of Mr. Delgado. It was never intended to appear suspicious." Victor leaned toward her, his whisper harsh but audible to those closest. "Don't admit to anything. Deny it all." But Mariana's mask cracked further. "Your Honor, I was only following instructions," she blurted, her voice rising. Gasps rippled through the room. Victor's eyes widened in fury. "You're lying," he hissed at her, though his voice carried just enough for the gallery to hear. The judge pounded his gavel. "Order in the court, this is a serious matter. Señora Costa, are you suggesting you were instructed to falsify evidence?" Mariana's face paled. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with her career already slipping through her fingers, she muttered, "Yes, I was." The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters nearly leapt from their seats, scribbling furiously. Cameras clicked in rapid fire. Julia's breath caught. She stared at the scene, her heart racing. Could it truly be unraveling this quickly? Victor shot to his feet, his voice booming. "This is absurd. A fabrication meant to discredit me. I would never instruct such a thing. This woman is desperate, trying to save herself." The judge's glare silenced him. "Sit down, Mr. Delgado." Victor's chest heaved, but he obeyed, slamming back into his chair with clenched fists. The investigator resumed. "Further, we traced communications between Señora Costa and third-party buyers of the stolen medication. These conversations align with the timeline of missing supplies. Payments were made, not to Julia Ramos, but to accounts linked to associates of Mr. Delgado's company." The gallery was no longer murmuring. It was roaring. The judge struck his gavel again. "Silence! If the gallery cannot restrain itself, I will clear the room." The noise subsided reluctantly. The prosecutor, who had once spoken with such confidence, now looked shaken, flipping through her papers as though the truth might be hiding between them. Julia rose slowly, her voice trembling but clear. "Your Honor, I have said from the beginning that I am innocent. I cared for those boys with everything I had. I wrote down every detail, every dose, every moment. I was accused because I was the easiest to blame. She lifted her notebook. This may not look like much compared to forged bank records and manipulated videos, but it is the truth. The judge nodded solemnly. Your words are noted, Senora Ramos. He turned to the jury box, his tone deliberate. What we see here is not only a case of theft, but of corruption. The evidence presented against the defendant has been revealed as false. The credibility of the accusations is shattered. Therefore, this court must deliver its verdict. Julia's chest tightened. She held her breath, her entire world balanced on the edge of his words. The judge's voice rang through the room. This court declares the defendant, Julia Ramos, not guilty of all charges. For a moment, silence hung. Then the room erupted. Reporters shouted, flashes blinded, and voices clashed in disbelief and triumph. Julia staggered, her knees weak, tears spilling down her cheeks. She whispered to herself, "It's over. Thank God it's over." Victor Delgado leapt to his feet, his face red with rage. "This is a travesty. You'll regret this." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Sit down or be removed from this courtroom, Mr. Delgado. And know this, investigations into your role will continue. The law is not blind." Mariana Costa was already being escorted out by officers, her head bowed in defeat. Julia remained standing, tears streaming freely as the gallery watched. Some clapped softly, others stared in shock. She did not care. The weight she had carried for weeks had lifted. She was free. Mateo and Gabriel, seated quietly with their nurse near the back, beamed when they saw her. Julia hurried toward them, kneeling beside the wheelchair. The boys reached out, their fragile arms wrapping around her. Gabriel whispered, "We knew they would believe you." Mateo added, "We told the truth, that's all it took." Julia held them close, sobbing with relief. "I love you both so much. You saved me." Outside the courthouse, the frenzy was overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras followed every step, but Julia ignored them. All she could see were the boys, their smiles, their trust. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, she leaned back, exhaustion flooding her body. She was free, but she knew the story was not finished. Victor Delgado's empire had begun to collapse, but he would not fall quietly. And yet, for the first time, Julia no longer feared him. The truth had spoken, louder than his money, louder than his lies. The world outside buzzed with headlines and scandal, but inside the quiet car, Julia whispered to the boys, "We'll never be apart again." They smiled, and for a fleeting moment, peace returned. But Victor Delgado's shadow still loomed. His empire was cracking, and with each fracture his desperation would only grow. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell. The storm of scandal had swept through São Paulo like wildfire. Victor Delgado's empire had crumbled under the weight of investigations. Contracts were cancelled, partners fled, and newspapers splashed his name across front pages with words like fraud, corruption, and betrayal. His attorney remained behind bars, awaiting trial of her own. Julia Ramos, however, was far away from that world now. She lived in a modest house on the edge of the city, its walls painted in soft colors, the air filled with the sound of children's laughter. It was not large, nor was it rich, but it was safe. Mateo and Gabriel had a room of their own, decorated with drawings taped to the walls and shelves lined with their favorite books. On a warm afternoon, Julia sat at the kitchen table folding laundry, while the twins argued over a board game in the living room. The sound made her smile. These were the noises she had once feared she would never hear again. Gabriel called out, his voice half laughter, half protest. "He's cheating again!" Mateo shouted back. "I'm not! You just don't know how to count!" Julia chuckled softly and called from the kitchen, "Play fair, both of you, or the game goes back on the shelf." The arguing quieted into giggles. Life was not easy. Money was still scarce, work irregular. But the boys were hers now, legally adopted after months of paperwork and hearings. They had chosen her, and the court had agreed. When the final papers were signed, Gabriel had whispered to her, "Now it's forever," and she had cried harder than she ever had in her life. As she set aside the folded clothes, There was a knock at the door. Julia opened it to find a letter on the step, sealed in an envelope with handwriting she instantly recognized. Her stomach tightened. She carried it to the table, sat down, and broke the seal. Inside, the words were simple, written in Victor Delgado's familiar hand. I have lost everything. The world believes I am guilty, and perhaps they are right. I am leaving the country. You won your freedom, Julia, and I cannot fight you anymore. Tell the boys I am sorry. Her hands trembled as she read. She expected anger to rise or relief, but instead there was only a strange emptiness. Victor had been a shadow over her life for so long, and now, with him gone, there was silence. Matteo appeared at her side, curious. What is it? Julia folded the letter quickly. Nothing important, just old business. Gabriel wheeled himself closer, tilting his head. You're not sad, are you? Julia looked at their faces, at the trust shining in their eyes, and shook her head. No, not sad. Just finished. The boys nodded, satisfied. They returned to their game, their laughter filling the house again. That evening, Julia sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon. The air smelled of rain and earth, and the sound of the twins' voices drifted through the open window. Her neighbor, Donna Rosa, came by with a basket of bread. The boys sound happy, she said warmly. They are, Julia replied. They finally sleep through the night without fear. Donna Rosa smiled, squeezing her shoulder. And you, do you sleep? Julia hesitated, then smiled faintly. I do now. After Rosa left, Julia remained on the porch, the letter still folded in her pocket. She thought about everything, the humiliation, the fear, the loneliness. She thought about the children walking into the courtroom, fragile but brave, breaking the silence with their voices. She whispered into the fading light, You saved me. Both of you saved me. Inside, the boys were calling her, Mama Julia, come play with us. She rose, her heart full. When she entered the room, Gabriel looked up from the game and said, Now we're a family forever, right? Julia knelt beside him, pulling both boys into her arms. Her voice shook as she answered, Yes, forever. The three of them stayed like that for a long time, holding each other while the evening settled around them. Outside, the city moved on. Scandals faded, new stories rose. But here in this small house, a different story had taken root. It was not a story of wealth or power, but of survival, love, and the quiet triumph of truth. And for Julia Ramos, it was enough.